She told him it was a booking glitch, and the worst part was how badly he wanted to believe her. Henry had lived alone for years, content with his quiet house and his quiet routine and the fence that kept everything safe and separate. Then Olivia moved in next door with her easy laugh and her lemon bars, and the way she looked at him like the years between them didn't matter. When she invited him to a mountain cabin for the weekend, he told himself it was just neighborly. He was wrong about that and about a few other things too. Henry was 52, and he lived alone in a house that was exactly the right size for one person. Two bedrooms, one he used and one he didn't. A kitchen with a table by the window, and a porch that wrapped around the front like it was waiting for someone to sit in it. He built furniture for a living, the kind of work that kept his hands busy and his mind somewhere between focused and far away. Tables and chairs and bookshelves, each one made from wood. He chose himself sanded until it was smooth enough that running your hand across it felt like touching water. The shop sat behind the house, and most mornings he was out there before the sun came up, listening to the saw and the radio and nothing else. He'd been married once, not unhappily, not dramatically, just married in the way two people can be when they stop reaching for each other and start living side by side like furniture in the same room. Her name was Diane, and she left on a Tuesday in October with two suitcases and a calm expression that hurt more than anger would have. They hadn't fought, and instead they'd simply faded, the way a photograph left in the sun loses its color so slowly you don't notice until you hold it next to what it used to be. That was 6 years ago. And since then, Henry had built a life around the absence of her, the way he built furniture around the grain of the wood, working with what was there instead of wishing it were different. He wasn't lonely, not in the way people mean when they use that word, like it's something to fix. He had his work and his porch and his routine, coffee at 6, shop by 7, dinner at 6:30, a book until his eyes got heavy, and then sleep in a bed that was always made on both sides. The house next door had been empty for 6 months, the for rent sign in the yard fading from red to pink. He'd grown used to the quiet from that side of the fence, and if he was honest, he preferred it that way. Quiet was safe, and safety was all he'd asked for, since Diane walked out and left him certain that the safest life was the one you lived alone. The moving truck arrived on a Saturday morning in late September, just as Henry was carrying his coffee out to the porch. He watched from his chair as two men carried boxes up the gravel driveway, and then a small blue car pulled in behind the truck with a surfboard strapped to the roof, which struck him as odd for a mountain town 6 hours from the nearest ocean. A woman stepped out of the car, and she looked up at the house the way you look at something you've already decided to love. She was younger than him, early 30s maybe, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a way of moving that made even standing still look like she was on her way somewhere interesting. She wore a red sweater and jeans and boots that had seen better days, and she carried a single canvas bag over one shoulder, like the rest of her life could fit in the truck, and she didn't need to keep it close. She saw him on the porch and waved a big open wave that didn't wait to see if he'd wave back, and that small, unself-conscious gesture told him more about her than a conversation ever could. He nodded back, and something in his chest shifted a quarter inch to the left, though he wouldn't realize that until much later. 3 days later, she appeared at the fence while he was sanding a table leg in the shop with the doors open. She introduced herself as Olivia, said she worked from home doing something in marketing that she promised was less boring than it sounded, and asked if she could borrow a hammer. He went inside and got one from the kitchen drawer, the same hammer he'd had for 15 years. And when he handed it over, she looked at it with genuine appreciation, like she could tell it was. She returned it that evening with the plate of lemon bars still warm from the oven, and she stood at the fence for 10 minutes, asking about the table he was building and listening to the answers like they mattered. Henry wasn't naive about what he felt when she was around, the pull that made him stand a little straighter and notice things like the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, or the particular warmth in her voice when she said his name. He also knew the rules he'd set for himself. The ones that said, keep your distance, don't reach for what you can't hold. And remember what happened the last time you let someone close enough to leave. So he smiled and nodded and kept the conversation short, and he convinced himself that was enough. Over the months that followed, something grew between them that neither of them named. Morning coffee on their respective porches, close enough to talk if they wanted to, far enough apart that they didn't have to. She'd ask about his work, and he'd ask about her day, and sometimes she'd bring over leftovers from whatever she'd cooked the night before, always too much for one person, she'd say, as if that explained why she kept making enough for two. He started leaving things on her porch, too. A cutting board he'd made from scrap walnut, a jar of honey from the farmer's market, small gestures that felt larger than they were because of how carefully he chose them. She learned that he'd rebuilt the porch himself, every board and every railing, and that he did his best thinking with a tool in his hand. He learned that she'd grown up in a town much like this one, somewhere in Virginia, and that she'd moved here on purpose, looking for something slower than the city she'd left behind. She told him she liked the sound of his saw in the mornings, that it made her feel like the day had started for real. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, and the nod said more than words would have. There were moments that hung in the air between them, like smoke from a fire that hasn't quite gone out. She'd touch his arm when she laughed at something he said, a quick brush of her fingers that left warmth behind. He'd linger at the fence a beat too long. After saying goodbye, his feet unwilling to carry him back to the quiet house, their eyes would hold across the narrow yard, and in those seconds the distance between them felt like a decision, not a fact. Each time, Henry pulled back. Not coldly, never coldly, but with the practiced care of a man who knows exactly where the line is. Because he drew it himself, Olivia never pushed. She never crossed the fence uninvited, and she never asked for more than he offered. She simply stayed, steady and warm and present, like a light left on in a window you keep meaning to walk toward. And that might be the most disarming thing of all, because Henry knew how to resist someone who demanded something from him, but he had no defense against someone who just kept showing up. And what he couldn't figure out was why she kept showing up, what she saw in him that made her willing to wait. That question would follow him all the way up the mountain. It was a Thursday evening in early spring when Olivia knocked on his door. He was in the kitchen, heating up soup, when he heard her knuckles on the wood, 3 quick raps that he learned to recognize. He opened the door, and she was standing there in a denim jacket with her hands in her pockets and a look on her face that said she'd been rehearsing something. She told him she'd booked a cabin in the mountains for the weekend, a writing retreat she'd been planning with a friend from college who'd had to cancel at the last minute because of a family emergency. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, she said, and she'd hate for the reservation to go to waste. The leaves were changing. The air was crisp. It would be nice to get away from town for a couple of days. Would he want to come along? Just as friends, she added quickly. Just a weekend in the mountains, nothing complicated. Henry stood in the doorway with the smell of soup behind him, and the smell of spring around her, and every instinct he had told him this was a bad idea. Not because he didn't trust her, because he did more than he'd trusted anyone in years, but because he didn't trust himself He knew what it felt like to sit beside her at the kitchen table, and he could imagine too clearly what it would feel like to spend a whole weekend in a cabin with her and the trees and no one else. And the thought of that much closeness scared him in a way he couldn't quite name. She made it easy for him to say yes. She framed it as practical, a reservation going to waste, two neighbors sharing a ride, no pressure, and no expectations. And maybe that was why he agreed, because she gave him permission to pretend it was just a weekend trip, just two friends driving up a mountain to look at leaves and drink coffee and nothing more. He packed a small bag that night, one change of clothes, a book he probably wouldn't read, and a toothbrush. He locked the door behind him the next morning and told himself for the 100th time that this was nothing more than neighborly. Olivia drove, and Henry rode in the passenger seat, with his hand on his knee and the window cracked enough to let the mountain air move through the car. She played music he didn't recognize, something soft and acoustic that matched the road and the trees, and she sang along under her breath in a way that made him smile without meaning to. The road climbed through tall pines and past open sky that felt bigger than the sky at home, and every curve revealed another stretch of nothing but trees and rock and the kind of quiet that lives in places where people haven't filled every inch. They talked easily about small things at first, the town they'd left behind, and the leaves that were just starting to turn, and a recipe she wanted to try for apple crisp if they could find a farm stand on the way. She asked him about the first piece of furniture he ever built, and he told her about a bookshelf he'd made for Diane that leaned slightly to the left and never stood straight, no matter how many times he adjusted it. Olivia laughed at that, a real laugh that filled the car, and she said that sounded like the kind of thing you keep anyway because it's got character, and he realized that was exactly what Diane had said about it too, and the memory didn't hurt the way it used to. The drive was 2 hours, and somewhere in the middle of it, Henry became aware of how close they were. Not just in the car, though that was close enough, her hand resting near the gear shift, only inches from his, the sleeve of her jacket brushing the console when she turned the wheel. But close in the way that counts, the way that means you've stopped performing and started just being, and he wasn't sure when that had happened, but it had, and he couldn't undo it by pulling away. Her hand stayed where it was, and his stayed where it was, and the road kept climbing, and the trees kept closing in, and the sky kept getting wider, and Henry kept his eyes on the road ahead because it was safer than looking at her. The cabin appeared through the trees like something out of a story he might have read as a boy. Small and wooden, with a stone chimney on one side and windows that looked out at nothing but forest and sky and the kind of silence that has its own sound. A porch ran across the front with 2 rocking chairs and a stack of firewood by the door, and the whole place sat in a clearing that felt like the world had made room for it on purpose. Henry stepped out of the car and stood looking at it with the quiet appreciation of a man who works with wood and knows good construction when he sees it. The tight joints in the framing, the clean lines of the roof, the way it sat on the land like it had grown there. Olivia was already on the porch, turning the key in the lock with an expression of genuine delight that made her look younger and happier than he'd ever seen her. She pushed the door open, and the inside matched the promise of the outside, perfectly wooden walls worn smooth by years of hands and weather, a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time, and windows. She dropped her bag by the door and spread her arms and said, "This is perfect," and she meant it, and he could tell. He set his bag in the room she pointed to, down the hall, what she called the second bedroom, and she took the room at the end of the hall with the door already open. They made dinner together that evening, standing side by side in the tiny kitchen, with their shoulders brushing every time one of them reached for a spoon or a plate. And she told him about a book she was reading, and he told her about a table he was building. And the conversation felt like the most natural thing in the world. After dinner, they sat by the fire she'd built, her with a book in her lap, and him with his eyes on the flames, and the silence between them was the kind that says more than talking ever could. It was the most comfortable evening Henry could remember in years, and that was precisely what frightened him. The ease of it, the way she fit into the space beside him like she'd always been there, the way the quiet didn't feel empty when she was in it. He watched the fire, listened to her turn pages, and felt something shifting inside him that he wasn't ready to name, something warm and heavy and patient that had been waiting a long time to be felt. Later that night, when the fire had burned down to embers and Olivia had gone to her room, Henry walked down the hall to his. He opened the door and stood in the doorway for a long moment because the room he was looking at was not a bedroom at all. It was a small workspace with a desk pushed against the wall, a wooden chair, a lamp, and a window that looked out at dark trees. And there was nothing in it that a person could sleep on unless they were willing to fold themselves into the chair like a coat on a hook. He checked the closet out of habit, knowing there wouldn't be a mattress hidden inside. He checked the hallway, the bathroom, anywhere a bed might have wandered off to. There was nothing, because the cabin had one bed, and it was in Olivia's room, and that was the whole story. He found her in the living room sitting on the couch, with her legs folded under her, and when he described what he'd found in the second room, she looked up at him with an expression that moved through surprise and embarrassment, and she picked up her phone and called the rental company, and he listened as she explained the situation in a voice that was calm and reasonable and just a little bit too steady. The agent on the other end apologized and said there'd been a mix-up with the listing. They'd make a note of it for next time, but there was nothing they could do tonight. Olivia thanked them and hung up, and then she bit her lower lip in a way he'd never seen her do before, and something about that small gesture told him more than the phone call had. The glitch sounded real, and so did the apology, and the mix-up with the listing sounded like exactly the kind of thing that happens when you rent a cabin online and trust a stranger's word about how many beds there are. And maybe it was all of those things, and maybe it wasn't. But Henry had spent his life reading the grain of wood, and he could tell when something didn't line up the way it was supposed to, and the look on Olivia's face when she bit her lip said she knew something she wasn't saying. The question of whether she'd planned this sat between them like a fourth wall, that neither of them was ready to break yet, but he was sure of one thing. His heart was beating faster than it had any reason to, and that mattered more than any answer. They stood in the living room after the call with the phone between them on the couch like a piece of evidence, and neither of them was very good at pretending this was simple. Henry offered to take the couch, which was too short for him by at least a foot. The kind of couch you sit on but never sleep on, and they both knew it the moment he said it. Olivia shook her head and said no, absolutely not, and offered to take the couch herself. And he said no, just as fast, and they were trapped in a polite standoff that was really about something neither of them wanted to name. Finally, Olivia looked at him with that direct gaze she had, the one that made him feel like she could see past every wall he'd ever built, and she said the bed was big enough. They were adults, she said, and they could share it without making it weird. She said it so casually, with such easy confidence that it almost worked, except for the part where her voice caught slightly on the word share, which told him she wasn't as casual about it as she was pretending to be, and the fact that he noticed told him he wasn't either. He agreed, telling himself it was practical, the only sensible solution, two reasonable people making the best of a minor inconvenience. He repeated that story a lot of ways as he stood in the bathroom brushing his teeth and looking at his own reflection, a 52-year-old man in a borrowed cabin, about to share a bed with a woman he'd spent months not letting himself think about. He turned off the light and walked down the hall and into her room, and she was already under the covers on the far side of the bed with the lamp on, reading her book like this was the most ordinary evening in the world. He got in on his side and kept a careful foot of space between them, the same distance he maintained at the fence and everywhere else in his life. And the mattress was warm and the room was cold, outside the covers, and he could hear her breathing, soft and steady, the sound of someone trying to read. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and felt the warmth of her body on the other side of that narrow gap, and he didn't sleep, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it wasn't, and that was the problem. Morning came gray and soft through the cabin windows, and they didn't talk about the night. They made coffee and eggs and sat at the small table with their knees almost touching under it, and the conversation was about the weather and the hike she wanted to take, and whether they could find a farm stand with fresh cider, except that they both lain awake, listening to each other breathe. They hiked that afternoon up a trail behind the cabin that wound through pines and over a creek and up to an overlook, where you could see the whole valley spread out below them like a painting someone had hung on the horizon. Olivia stood at the edge, with wind pulling at her hair and her face tilted up toward the sun, and Henry watched her from a few steps back and thought that she looked like someone who had arrived. She turned and caught him looking, and she didn't look away, and neither did he. And that was something they'd never done before in the daylight, in the open, with nowhere to hide the meaning of it. They cooked dinner together again. Pasta this time with a sauce she made from things she'd found in the cabin pantry. And they ate by the fire, and she sat closer to him than she had the night before, her shoulder against his, her hand resting on the blanket near his, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her even where they weren't touching. He didn't move away, couldn't move away, because every reason he'd given himself for keeping his distance felt thinner than the mountain air, and the only thing keeping him on his side of the space between them was a promise he'd made to himself years ago that no longer made sense in this room with this woman on this night. She asked him a question over dinner that sounded simple but wasn't. She asked if he was happy. Not the kind of question where someone wants you to say yes, but the kind where someone genuinely wants to know the answer, even if it's hard to hear. He looked at her across the candle she'd lit on the table, and he thought about his quiet house and his empty porch, and the years he'd spent building a life so careful that nothing could reach him, and he said no. He said he wasn't happy. He was safe, and those were different things, and he'd only just realized it. The honesty of it surprised them both, and something shifted in the space between them. A door that had been closed for so long, he'd forgotten it was there, opening a crack and letting in a kind of light he hadn't felt in years. After that, there was no going back to pretending, and they both knew it. Night fell again, and they got into the bed like they had the night before. But this time, the careful foot of space had shrunk to inches. Neither of them had moved on purpose, or at least that's what they would have said if asked, because it had just happened. The way things happen when two people stop pretending they don't want to be close. The mattress was warm with both of them in it, and the room was dark, except for the thin line of moonlight that fell across the covers, And the silence was full in the kind of way that only happens when there's something waiting to be said. Olivia spoke first, her voice quiet and steady and closer to him than it had been the night before, and she told him she hadn't invited him here just because her friend had to cancel. The cabin was always meant for two, she said, and she'd booked it with him in mind from the start. And the second bedroom was never really a bedroom at all, but a workspace with a desk and a window, which she'd known when she made the reservation. The glitch wasn't a glitch. She'd chosen this cabin knowing there was only one bed, hoping he'd come, and hoping the cabin would do what she couldn't do on her own, bring them close enough to stop pretending. Henry listened without interrupting and without moving away, lying on his back with his hands at his sides, and his heart beating so hard she must have been able to hear it. And he took in the sound of the wind against the glass, and the silence that followed her words, that small quiet that comes after someone has said the truest thing they know how to say. He asked her why him, why this, why now after months of coffee on porches and lemon bars and conversations that never went far enough. She said because she'd been waiting for him to see her the way she saw him, and he never would from across a fence. She said she was tired of being patient. She said she'd watched him pull back every time they got close, and she understood why he did it. She even admired the discipline of it, but she couldn't keep living on one side of a line that only he had drawn. And then she said his name, just his name, Henry. And it sounded like everything she hadn't said in all those months of borrowing hammers and leaving plates of food on his porch and sitting where he could see her from his window. Henry didn't speak right away, lying there in the dark with the weight of everything she'd said, settling over him like snow on a roof, heavy and quiet and impossible to ignore. He felt the years he'd spent building his careful life, the walls he'd constructed board by board around his heart, and he felt the woman beside him who had somehow walked through all of it without asking permission, just by being there, just by staying, just by not leaving. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, and he told her about Diane. Not the version he usually told, the one about two people who simply grew apart, but the real one, the one where he'd stopped reaching for her first and she'd stopped reaching back, and by the time they both noticed the distance, it was too wide to cross. He told her that after Diane left, he'd promised himself he'd never let someone get that close again, because losing someone you love doesn't just take away the person. It takes away your certainty that the love was real in the first place. You start to wonder if you imagined the whole thing, if the warmth you felt was just something you wanted so badly that you made it up, and that doubt is worse than the loss. He told her he'd known for months what he felt when he looked at her, that he'd known it the evening she returned his hammer with lemon bars, and stood in the fading light asking about his table, like the answer mattered, and he'd known it every morning since, when he heard her door open and the sound of her steps on her porch, and his whole body turned toward the fence before his mind could stop it. He told her he kept his distance, not because he didn't want her, but because he thought he was protecting her from a man who'd already failed at the one thing that mattered, who'd let love slip through his hands once and might not be strong enough to hold it if it came again. And then he told her the thing he'd never said out loud, not to Diane, not to anyone. He told her he didn't want to be careful anymore, that he'd rather risk losing something than never have it at all, that the years of safety and solitude had kept him from pain, but they'd also kept him from her, and standing in front of her on that overlook today, with the wind in her hair and the whole valley at her back, he'd realize that the thing he was most afraid of wasn't losing her. It was never having her in the first place. She reached for his hand in the dark, and when he took it, her fingers were warm and sure, and they fit into his like they'd always known the shape. And the silence that followed wasn't empty or awkward or full of things unsaid. It was full the way a room is full when someone has finally come home after being away too long and everything is exactly where they left it, and all they have to do is sit down and stay. The morning came soft and golden through the cabin windows, and when Henry opened his eyes, Olivia was still asleep beside him with her head on the pillow and her hand still resting near his on the covers. There was no careful distance between them now, no foot of space, no pretense. He watched her for a moment, the way her hair fell across her face, and the slow rise and fall of her breathing. And then he looked away, not because he shouldn't be looking, but because some things feel too private even to witness, like a prayer someone says when they think no one is listening. They made breakfast together, eggs and toast and coffee, and she stood beside him at the counter the way she had the day before and the day before that, but now it felt different. Now her shoulder against his wasn't something that happened by accident in a small kitchen. It was something that happened on purpose, and the purpose was to be close to him, and that knowledge hung in the air between them like a third person in the room, warm. He poured her coffee without asking how she took it, because he already knew 2 sugars and a splash of milk, and she smiled when he handed her the mug in a way that said she'd noticed that he knew. They didn't talk about what happens next. Not yet. They were still inside the cabin, and the cabin still felt like a world that existed outside of rules, a place where 2 people who'd stopped counting the years between them could share a bed and a breakfast, and a look that meant more than either of them could say, and none of it needed explaining. But Henry knew the mountain road went both ways, and eventually they'd have to drive back down into the town where people notice things and talk about them over the fence, and where the distance between their houses would feel like a measurement again. He looked at her across the small table, with the candle still sitting in the center from the night before, and he realized that the thought of people knowing didn't scare him anymore. Not because the cabin had made him brave, but because he'd been brave enough to let the cabin happen in the first place, brave enough to say yes when she knocked on his door, brave enough to tell her the truth about what he felt when every fiber of his being told him to keep it hidden. For the first time in years, the idea of someone knowing how he felt didn't feel like a threat. It felt like relief. They packed the car in the late morning, loading their bags into the trunk of the small blue car with the surfboard still strapped to the roof, and Olivia drove them back down the mountain the way they'd come. But this time, somewhere on the winding road through the pines, her hand found his on the gear shift, and he didn't pull away. He turned his palm up, and she laced her fingers through his, and they drove like that for miles, with the windows down and the music playing and the mountain falling away behind them, and Henry thought that this was what it felt like to stop building walls and start building something else instead. When they pulled into the driveway, the fence between their houses looked different, smaller, like something they both constructed together without knowing it, a line drawn in the dirt that had seemed important once, but now was just a thing they could step over if they chose to. They sat in the car for a long moment, with the engine off and the afternoon light coming through the windshield, and Olivia turned to him with a look that was half question and half answer, and he understood that she was asking if this was real, if what happened in the cabin would survive the drive home and the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon. Walking her to the door, he paused while she turned around before going inside, standing on the porch where they'd had 100 morning conversations over coffee, and she asked him if he wanted to come in for coffee. They both knew that wasn't what she was asking. She was asking if he was still choosing this, if the brave thing he'd said in the dark still held up in the daylight, if he meant it when he said he didn't want to be careful anymore. He said yes, and the word came out steady and sure, not because the mountain air had changed him, but because he'd chosen to let this happen from the start. Not because she'd tricked him into closeness, but because she'd offered him a way out of his own walls and he'd finally taken it. The distance between them, the fence and the years, and the careful space he'd kept, was never protection at all. It was just a way of avoiding the risk of being seen, and what the cabin gave them wasn't a trick or an accident, but a chance to stop, pretending they didn't want exactly what they'd found. The door closed behind them, and the porch light was on at both houses tonight. Some glitches are worth keeping, and some distances are meant to disappear. If you want more stories about the moments that change everything, subscribe. The porch light stays on